campaigning and go door knocking and meet with Canadians and listen to Canadians' concerns and needs. And I have to say that I'm very touched to be here this morning because my mum, Estelle, who is a former nurse who worked in psychiatry, taught me that self-care but caring for others is a way of being. And some people do it as a job, and most of the caregivers in this country are women. And as a mother who's had 3 kids, I have to say that nurses have wings. And without these incredible, knowledgeable caregivers in a society, we wouldn't be where we are, especially through this pandemic. And most importantly, we need to nourish, celebrate, and protect their jobs and the way that they do their jobs as well. So thank you for having me, for having my family, and for everything that you do. Merci à toutes les infirmières, tous les gens qui travaillent aux soins de santé. Je suis quelqu'un qui a une maman qui est infirmière et qui a toujours eu cette profession à cœur. J'ai beaucoup de respect et d'admiration envers les gens qui sont dans notre service de santé, surtout durant évidemment cette pandémie qu'on a traversée. Et des grands-parents évidemment qui ont été aux soins de longue durée. À tous les gens qui sont dans les services hospitaliers, dans les cliniques, partout, merci pour ce que vous faites. Vous changez notre société, vous avez des ailes d'ange, profondément. Merci pour tout. Et maintenant, il y a quelqu'un que je connais qui veut vous en parler plus longuement.
Merci Sophie. Merci Soph, merci d'être parmi nous tous ce matin. What a pleasure to be here. It's a treat to have Sophie and Hadrian with me. They've been out here in BC supporting some local candidates and connecting with some of my BC family. This is a great day to be back in my second home in BC with so many members of our great team from our local candidate and extraordinary doctor herself, Hedy Fry. Thank you, Hedy, for being here, but also a number of local candidates like Josh and Virginia. But I also want to introduce you to Navreen, who is our candidate in Abbotsford, who is a frontline doctor as well, who has been through this pandemic like so many in ways that have been there for each other, because that has been the story of this pandemic, of people stepping up for each other throughout in real and tangible ways. From Canadians making the decision to stay home to keep each other safe, to wearing masks and washing our hands and keeping our distances and avoiding non-essential services for many, many months while we needed to, Canadians stepped up. And even as we did, we knew we were doing it for our loved ones, we were doing it for elders, but we also kept in mind we were doing it for those essential workers who had to keep going into work every single day to keep people safe. And first and foremost above them, our frontline health workers, nurses, doctors, healthcare practitioners who were putting themselves through double shifts, long hours, being there day after day through this crisis where in the beginning there were just so many unknowns, and not just sacrificing for themselves, but sacrificing for their kids as well, risking their kids' health every time they came home. And they kept doing it, and I am so honored to be able to stand here with nurses, doctors, and healthcare practitioners from across the Lower Mainland to tell them what I know all Canadians want to say to them, that even as you have had our back through these past 18 months in extraordinary ways in being heroes, so too will we have your backs. That's what Canadians do. We stick up for each other. We stick up for the most vulnerable, and we stick up for those caring for our most vulnerable. So this morning I'm announcing that the Liberal Party of Canada, if re-elected to form government, will make it a criminal offence to block access to buildings that provide health care, whether that's hospitals, clinics, abortion clinics, pharmacies, testing centres. It is not okay that across the country, hospitals are having to put up barricades today to manage the mobs coming their way. It's not okay any day to know that a nurse going into a late shift, crossing a parking lot, might be afraid that there could be someone there to spit on her or shout obscenities at her. That's not okay, and Canadians want to stand up for our healthcare practitioners. And further, we're going to make it a criminal offense for anyone to threaten or intimidate any healthcare practitioner on their way into work, in the practice of their exercise of their duty, or a patient on their way to get medical services. It's unfortunate, really, that we have to get to this point where we have to point out that that's not something that should be done. And in this pandemic, perhaps we've gotten used to saying, oh my God, we never would have thought we'd have to do this, we never would have thought we'd have to do that. But this one we need to pause on. It's not right that the people tasked with keeping us safe and alive during this pandemic should be exposed to hatred, violence, fear, and intimidation. À travers le pays aujourd'hui, on est en train de voir dans différents hôpitaux l'installation de barricades pour protéger les travailleurs de la santé contre les anti-vax. C'est pas correct. Dans ce pays, on est là les uns pour les autres. C'est ce qu'on a démontré pendant 18 mois de la pandémie. C'est ce qu'on a démontré en étant là les uns pour les autres dès le début. Et ceux qui ont été le plus là pour nous, les travailleurs de la première ligne, surtout les travailleurs de la santé, ont fait des sacrifices énormes pour mettre leur famille à risque, pour servir la communauté, pour nous garder en vie. Et maintenant, ils ont besoin qu'on soit là pour eux de façon non équivoque. Nous allons donc rendre ça illégal de bloquer accès à un bâtiment où on livre des services de soins de santé, que ce soit des hôpitaux, des cliniques d'avortement, des pharmacies, des centres de dépistage. Fini l'intimidation. On va aussi rendre ça illégal d'intimider ou de faire des menaces un travailleur de la santé en fonction de leur service, ou en route pour fonction de leur service, ou bien tout patient qui est en train d'aller chercher des soins de santé. Je suis d'accord que c'est un peu ridicule qu'on soit rendu à ce point-ci, dans ce pays-ci. Tu sais, on en vit des premières pendant cette pandémie. On a quasiment arrêté de dire « Oh mon Dieu, j'aurais jamais imaginé qu'on aurait dû faire ceci ou qu'on aurait dû faire cela. » Mais celle-ci est tough. Dans un pays comme le Canada, où on est profondément là les uns pour les autres comme valeur profonde, de devoir dire de façon explicite que non, vous ne devriez pas être en train de faire peur à des infirmières pendant qu'elles vont faire leur travail. On ne devrait pas pouvoir cracher ou crier après les médecins qui sont en train de rentrer pour sauver des vies. On est là et on va le faire parce que, en tant que Canadiens, on doit toujours être là les uns pour les autres. And that's something we've seen, people being there for each other throughout this pandemic. And we want to make it so that people who are making the right choices for themselves, for their loved ones, continue to be supported. That's why when people travel, when my son, who's only 7 and therefore can't get double vaccinated, gets on a plane in the coming months, no one should have to worry that he has to sit beside someone who's refused to get vaccinated, who's going to put him at risk. That's why we're saying, unequivocally, travelers need to get vaccinated. Why we're also saying that we're going to foot the bill for provinces like British Columbia and many others who are moving forward with proof of vaccination programs to make sure that as people get back to restaurants, bars, and gyms, and movie theaters, that they can know that they and our youngest are safe. And further, we're going to bring in new legal protections to make sure that any business that wants to bring in mandatory vaccinations, that means to make sure that all of their customers are not putting each other at risk, should have no fear of being sued or pursued in justice for having done the right thing. C'est des choses que nous faisons parce que nous savons que l'essentiel dans cette pandémie, c'est d'en finir pour de bon. Et la seule façon de faire ça, c'est avec les vaccinations. Malheureusement, M. O'Toole n'a pas ce leadership, n'est pas équivoque à ce niveau, sans équivoque à ce niveau-là. Il ne peut même pas exiger que ses propres candidats soient vaccinés. Il est indifférent si une candidate non vaccinée, non pleinement vaccinée, se retrouve dans un centre de personnes âgées. Ben voyons. Mr. O'Toole can't even demand that his own candidates be vaccinated. He can't even defend, or he is defending his candidate who went to visit seniors in an old age home without being fully vaccinated. That's not the leadership we need for this pandemic to get through it, but it's also not the leadership we need to recover our economy. Mr. O'Toole likes to talk about economic growth and the economy, but you can't get to any of that unless we finish with this pandemic. And that means making sure, with clear leadership, that people get vaccinated. And we are the only ones with that clear leadership on it. And we're seeing that lack of leadership from Mr. O'Toole on a number of different subjects. Whether it's how we're moving forward on keeping assault weapons illegal and bringing in a buyback program. He's in the pockets of the gun lobby on that one. He wants to see communities get assault weapons back amongst them, back across the country. That doesn't make sense, but it only makes sense because he's in the pocket of the gun lobby. He's giving in to his anti-vax fringe elements in his caucus. He's not standing up unequivocally for a woman's right to choose, because he can't even lead on ensuring that his candidates and MPs vote in favor of a woman's right to choose. 80 of them voted against women's choice in the last election. And when provinces across this country start to roll back access to abortion services or reproductive services, he said he will not intervene. He will not tell provinces how to deliver health care. Well, I'm sorry, it is the job of the federal government to enforce the Canada Health Act, and that means making sure that every province and territory steps up on providing access to the full range of reproductive services across the country. And he said he won't do that. Well, we will, as we have, in putting pressure in New Brunswick, as we needed to a few years ago in PEI. We will continue to stand up unequivocally with real leadership on a woman's right to choose. Et ici, en Colombie-Britannique, je ne peux ne pas parler des changements climatiques. Il propose de revenir aux cibles de M. Harper. Ben voyons donc. Ce n'est pas l'approche Harper qui va protéger l'environnement ni créer les emplois nécessaires dans les années à venir. Here in BC, I can't but talk about how important it is to protect our environment. Mr. O'Toole is proposing to go back to the Stephen Harper approach. The Stephen Harper targets, which we're already on track to largely surpassing, he wants to roll back the clock because he doesn't understand that protecting our planet from climate change isn't just about the well-being of future generations, it's about the jobs for future generations. It's about economic growth. He is so misguided that he is proposing to resurrect the Northern Gateway pipeline through the Great Bear Rainforest and bring back tanker traffic onto BC's north coast. That's not what British Columbians want. Speaking of Northern Gateway, that's a perfect example of where Mr. Singh and the NDP are just wrong. They're trying to say, oh, it makes no difference whether there's a Liberal government or a Conservative government. Well, for British Columbians who care about the Great Bear Rainforest, it makes a really big difference. Particularly because Mr. Singh just seems to be pivoting to those attacks because his own climate plan has been so profoundly panned by experts, including top experts here in BC. We are the party with the best progressive plan to keep Canada moving forward, to get through this pandemic. And we're the only progressive party that can stop Erin O'Toole and his Conservatives from taking Canada backwards. And that's what this election is about. Do we end this pandemic for good and build an even stronger future that's supporting British Columbians and all Canadians with $10 a day childcare, stepping up with real measures to address the housing crisis and help people afford their first homes, not give $500 million in tax cuts to the wealthiest landlords, which is Mr. O'Toole's investments in housing? It's a choice right now about the government that can end this pandemic and move forward for everyone. That's why the choice is so clear. For British Columbians, for all Canadians, I choose moving forward for everyone. Merci. Now that he's gone, you can ask the toughest questions you want.
Thank you, Mr. Trudeau. We'll now start the question period with 20 minutes, one question, one follow-up, starting with John Iverson from the National Post.
So you said last night at your rally that if Canadians want the pandemic to end for good, vote Liberal. Are you suggesting that the pandemic is going to get worse if we had a Conservative or an NDP government? And we've been asked to keep our times, there's a time limit on our questions, so if you could be succinct, please.
Okay. Experts are unequivocal. Top doctors, top health professionals, unequivocal. Vaccination of as many people as possible across our country is the way we keep safe, not just from this wave of COVID, but from future waves of COVID-19. We have enough vaccines for everyone who's eligible, and we have boosters secured on the way for when those are needed. What we need is leadership that is going to be unequivocal that Canadians need to get vaccinated. Not leadership like Mr. O'Toole, who pretends that testing is equivalent to vaccination. Just ask someone in a ventilator in the ICU how testing helped them. Vaccination is the way forward, which is why over the past many months we have been putting forward information campaigns, educational initiatives, community outreach programs, drop-in clinics in neighborhoods to make sure that as many people as possible can get vaccinated, and it's working because Canadians are doing better on vaccination just about any other country in the world. But we need to do more to keep people safe and encourage vaccination. That's why I'm the only leader that is unequivocal that any traveler needs to be vaccinated on a plane or a train, that federal public servants need to be vaccinated, and that we will actually foot the bill for any province that moves forward with mandatory vaccine passports, because that has shown that uptake of vaccines spikes massively.
Next question.
Abigail Beeman, Global News. On your announcement today, it's already illegal to utter threats, it's illegal to assault someone. Is this more than a flashy election promise, and why would that legislation be necessary?
There are specific protections in the criminal code against intimidation of journalists. Specific protections in the criminal code against intimidation or threats against folks working in the justice system. We are going to add specific threats against healthcare practitioners as requiring those protections. And it's unfortunate that we got there, but we think that these people deserve our highest level of protection because they have done so much for all of us over these past 18 months. Il y a des protections spécifiques pour les journalistes d'intimidation. Il y a des protections spécifiques dans le code criminel contre l'intimidation de juges, de personnes qui travaillent dans notre système de justice. Nous trouvons que c'est dommage qu'on en soit là, mais on est là. Nous devons d'assurer les meilleures protections pour tous ceux qui travaillent dans notre système de santé contre l'intimidation et l'harcèlement.
Prochaine question.
Bonjour M. Trudeau, Louis Blouin de Radio-Canada. Le scénario d'un gouvernement minoritaire est bien réel. J'aimerais ça vous entendre clairement ce matin, puis je pense que les Canadiens méritent une réponse claire là-dessus. Si vous n'obtenez pas le plus grand nombre de sièges, est-ce que vous excluez la possibilité de former un gouvernement en vous alliant à un autre parti?
Écoute, je ne vais pas répondre à des questions hypothétiques maintenant. On va continuer de travailler à tous les jours pour démontrer qu'on a le meilleur plan pour en finir avec la pandémie, pour rebâtir en mieux, pour protéger les Canadiens, pour appuyer les familles. Et les Canadiens ont encore une semaine pour faire leur choix. Nous les encourageons d'écouter attentivement les contrastes entre le leadership et la vision présentée par les conservateurs versus le Parti libéral et les autres partis.
Donc vous ne l'écartez pas.
Next question.
Good morning, Christy Kirkup with the Globe and Mail. Mr. Trudeau, why not authorize the clerk of the Privy Council to hand over all cabinet documents related to the SNC-Lavalin affair to the RCMP?
These were discussions that were fully had 2 years ago when this issue came forward, fully litigated before the last election. And I hear clearly from Canadians that their preoccupations are on the pandemic, on moving forward, on ensuring that we are building for a better future. I have answered all of those questions many, many times. There have been committee studies. There have been all these processes.
I just asked you about the clerk, though. Why not authorize the clerk of the Privy Council to hand over the documents?
Decisions that was a question that Globe and Mail and others asked many times 2 years ago when all this issue was being fully litigated. The clerk of the Privy Council at the time testified before committee to this and other things. This is something that we talked about 2 years ago and that answers were fully given 2 years ago on.
Next question.
Hi, Mr. Trudeau, Tom Barry, CBC. I want to ask you about the tone of the campaign. You're talking about Erin O'Toole being in the back pocket of the gun lobby, catering to anti-vaxxers. He's making some very pointed attacks on your character. And I'm wondering if both of you are feeding into the anger that we're seeing in some parts of society. Are you in effect making it worse?
I know it's easy to sort of say, oh, this person's saying negative things, that person's saying negative things, a pox on all their houses. But there is a difference between the kinds of personal attacks that Mr. O'Toole has been engaged in since he became leader and that we're seeing right now, and the clear differences of perspective and policy that I've been highlighting from the very beginning. I'm not inventing Mr. O'Toole's position on restoring rights for people to own military-style assault weapons. It's on page 90 of his platform. And he came back with, oh, well, we'll work with gun owners on a review of those banned weapons, and we'll see what happens. That's not something that Canadians agree with. And Mr. O'Toole is not telling the truth with Canadians about the deals he made with the gun lobby. That's not an attack on his character. That's about his positioning and his choices as a leader. His choice to go back to the Stephen Harper approach on climate change, to targets that we've already surpassed and need to go even further on. I'm not impugning his character. I'm not saying he doesn't love his kids. I'm saying he's wrong about how to ensure jobs and prosperity and a protected country for people in the future. But that's what Canadians get to choose. I'm going to let him and his proxies in the anti-vaxxer movement, in the gun lobby, in the anti-choice crowd, continue to attack me fine. I'm going to continue to stay focused on Canadians, on what Canadians are telling me about what they need for their families, what they need for the fight against climate change, about what they need to end this pandemic once and for all. Okay. On a vu que M. O'Toole reprend les habitudes qu'il a démontrées pendant longtemps à la Chambre des communes, de faire des attaques très personnelles contre moi. Moi, je ne crois pas à des attaques personnelles. Mais comme les gens voient très bien, je suis très clair sur nos différences politiques, nos différences d'opinion sur comment on doit rebâtir en mieux, comment on va finir avec cette pandémie. Quand je parle du fait que M. O'Toole veut ramener les armes à feu que nous, on a rendues illégales, les armes de style assaut, c'est parce qu'il le dit clairement dans sa plateforme écrite, à la page 96. Et quand il essaye un petit peu de reculer, il y a encore tellement de flou là-dedans qu'on voit que non, il va réviser ses armes à feu et peut-être qu'il va en légaliser certaines, mais pas d'autres. Ben voyons, c'est pas ça que les Canadiens veulent. Il est en train d'essayer de mettre du flou dans la tête des Canadiens pour sa position. C'est pareil pour les changements climatiques. Il veut ramener l'approche de Stephen Harper sur les changements climatiques. Ben voyons, on a déjà dépassé les cibles que M. Harper avait proposées. On est en route pour les dépasser de loin. Et on doit en faire encore plus. Il veut nous ramener. Ben, c'est pas parce qu'il n'aime pas ses enfants. Je suis sûr qu'il aime beaucoup ses enfants comme moi. Mais il fait les mauvais choix pour les Canadiens, pour leur avenir. Et ça, je dois le dire et je vais le dire. Mais quand lui il se replie sur des attaques personnelles, sur mon caractère, sur ma personne, je pense que c'est pas ça que les Canadiens veulent voir. Et surtout, quand lui il se préoccupe de moi, je reste préoccupé des Canadiens, de leur avenir, de ce qu'on est en train de faire pour en finir avec cette pandémie et pour rebâtir en mieux.
Prochaine question.
Bonjour, M. Trudeau. Catherine Lévesque, la presse canadienne. Je voulais vous faire réagir à deux choses qu'Erin O'Toole a dites dans les derniers jours. Tout d'abord, que l'arme utilisée au collège Dawson était illégale et c'est par la suite rétracté. Il a dit qu'elle avait été procurée de façon illégale, mais aussi sur l'allocation canadienne aux enfants qui serait disponible à partir de 7 mois quand l'enfant est encore un fœtus. Est-ce que c'est une façon détournée de rouvrir le débat à l'avortement?
Ben, tout d'abord, on voit que sur l'enjeu du contrôle des armes à feu, non seulement les instincts, mais les positions et même les faits de M. O'Toole tendent toujours vers essayer de tromper les Canadiens. Il ne peut pas dire la vérité parce qu'il sait que le deal qu'il a signé avec le lobby des armes à feu, le deal qu'il a conclu avec le lobby des armes à feu pour gagner le leadership du Parti conservateur du Canada, c'est pas quelque chose aligné avec les valeurs ni des Québécois ni des Canadiens. Alors, il se retrouve dans une position où il dit un peu n'importe quoi pour s'en sortir, mais les Canadiens ont besoin de politiques basées sur les faits et d'être là pour protéger nos citoyens et les communautés. Par rapport à l'allocation canadienne aux enfants, ben, c'est une initiative du gouvernement libéral contre lequel les conservateurs avaient voté, qui donne plus d'argent, des centaines de dollars par mois, sans impôt, à des familles qui en ont besoin. On l'a augmenté plusieurs fois par rapport au lien avec les groupes anti-choix. Je pense qu'on a vu qu'il doit prendre des mesures pour apaiser les membres de son caucus, il y en a 80 d'entre eux qui ont voté contre le droit d'une femme de choisir. Moi, je n'ai pas vu directement le lien dont vous parliez, mais c'est vrai que c'est peut-être un facteur de vouloir ramener par la cour arrière le débat sur l'avortement. On sait que c'est quelque chose qu'on voit régulièrement des conservateurs.
Next question.
Good morning, Mr. Trudeau. Steve Scheer, Reuters. Yesterday, we know that there are PPC members in these anti-vaxxer groups, protesters. We saw one yesterday. But earlier, in this press conference, you said that Erin O'Toole has proxies from his party that are participating in these anti-vaxxer protests. Last night, you said that the anti-vax wing of his own party had people in the mobs that were harassing doctors, nurses, waiters, and business owners. I wanted to ask what evidence you have that there are Conservative Party members, and are there any campaign, is there any evidence that the campaign is involved in these anti-vax protests?
Well, we saw in one of the early protests that members of the local campaign, Conservative campaign team came out to it. They were repudiated and kicked off of the campaign, but you have to ask yourself, when it is so clear on the science that vaccinations are the way through, when he actually demands that everyone on the tour around him, from media to others, need to be fully vaccinated to travel with his Leaders Tour, but he will not ensure that his candidates are fully vaccinated, even though Canadians are incredulous about that and obviously not supportive of that. Almost 80% of Canadians who did their duty, did the right thing and got themselves vaccinated. You have to know that there is an awful lot of pressure from inside his party to do that, to leave room for that. And I think it was telling, the language he's using recently when asked about PPC voters and sympathizers. His answer is, the Conservative Party is a big tent under my leadership. Meaning there is room in his Conservative Party for anti-vaxxers, for gun lobbyists, for anti-choice activists. That's the big tent that he is casting, to include people who find themselves outside the fringes of the mainstream. Whereas as a Liberal Party, we are unequivocal. If you want to be a candidate for us, you have to be fully vaccinated. And more, we're going to make sure that travelers are fully vaccinated, that we're working with provinces who put forward vaccine mandates, that we are protecting people, including healthcare workers, from those who would scream obscenities at them and spit on them on their way into work to save lives.
Next question.
Morgan Lowry, Canadian Press. Following up a bit on this rhetoric, I mean, last night you said that people should vote Liberal if they want the pandemic to end sometime soon. Isn't that taking it a little bit too far to suggest, I know you think your policies are the best, but to suggest that only the Liberal Party can end the pandemic, whereas the others can't?
It would be harder to say and mean if Erin O'Toole was actually showing leadership on how to get through this pandemic. He's out there pretending that testing is just as good as getting a vaccine. No, the people who won't get vaccinated will get tested regularly. Well, that does nothing to prevent an unvaccinated individual from ending up in the ICU. The way to end this pandemic is to trust science and experts and our medical practitioners who are unequivocal and who are despairing. I mean, I've read heart-wrenching accounts, including recently from a doctor in Edmonton on CBC, talking about an unvaccinated patient fighting for his life in his hospital. It makes no sense to pretend that you want to get through this pandemic, to pretend that we have to rebuild our economy, and not show clear and unequivocal leadership on the one thing that gets us through it. I mean, we all saw for months the Conservatives shouting at the Liberal government that we had to get enough vaccines. We weren't getting enough vaccines. Get more vaccines. And we did. We delivered vaccines ahead of schedule for all Canadians. And now they don't want to talk about vaccination anymore. They don't want to talk about vaccines. They're defending the personal choice of those who choose to endanger each other and our kids, rather than standing up for the personal freedoms of those who did the right thing to be safe, to keep their kids safe, and to avoid the further lockdowns and economic slowdowns that happen when you're not leading on vaccination. So yes, the choice is clear. We are the party and the government that will continue to stand unequivocally for science and for keeping Canadians safe from this pandemic.
Next question.
Kevin Gallagher, CTV News. In 2015, you committed to a gender-balanced cabinet, but we're not seeing the same type of representation when it comes to race. So, fewer than 30% of your staff self-identify as Black, Indigenous, or people of color. If you win September 20th, will you commit to ensuring the Prime Minister's office and ministerial staff, including chiefs of staff, are at least 50% BIPOC?
We have committed to increasing the representation across government, across institutions, including in our own office, of diverse Canadians from the broadest range of communities possible. We have continued to increase representation amongst our candidates, amongst our staff, amongst leaders in government, and we will continue to do exactly that.
Last question.
Ashley Burke, CBC News. Why has there been some reluctance, or why haven't you come out at this point and said, I want a majority and here's why, this would help me with this, what I'm promising to move forward? And is anything less than a majority a failure to you?
As I've said, this is an election that is going to determine the government and the parliament that will be taking really big decisions for Canadians in the coming weeks and months. Not a year from now or 2 years from now when the next scheduled election was supposed to be, right now. And on issues like vaccination passports and mandatory vaccinations for travelers, there are really stark choices about how we end this pandemic. On things like childcare, on things like protecting our environment, on keeping communities safe by keeping assault weapons banned, there are clear and stark differences between what we're proposing as progressives and what the Conservative Party is proposing in terms of taking us back. And I think Canadians understand that this is an important choice to make, that we need a strong and clear mandate for Parliament and for government from Canadians to do the things that matter. Fighting climate change, supporting families with childcare and housing, ending this pandemic once and for all.
Thank you. This is what I'm still expressing.
Merci tout le monde.